To one and all present here. I am Meenakshi Tomar, and I'm going to be the moderator of today's International Research Symposium. On behalf of Jindal Global Business School, I welcome all the participants and panelists to the International Research Symposium on Importance of Marketing Research in the 21st Century. I truly believe as the faculty in this area that we are having a discussion on one of the hot topics that has not only caught attention of late, but is going to help the young scholars and researchers in many more ways. We have with us on the panel Dr. N. Jayanta Devashri, Professor, Sabargamaba, University of Sri Lanka. He is also the brand ambassador at Emerald Publishing. We have Dr. Isuru Praswate, lecturer in Business and Management, University of the West of Scotland, UK. We have Dr. Charita Harshini Pereira, lecturer, Faculty of Business and Law, Northumbria University, UK. And we have Dr. Nirma Sadamali Jayavardhana, Assistant Professor, OP Jindal Global University, on panel with us. On behalf of JGBS, we welcome you all to this very interesting international symposium. Well, to begin with, we will first start with the talk by Professor N. Jayanta Devashri. I would take a moment to introduce Dr. N. Jayanta Devashri to all the attendees. Professor Devashri N. Jayanta is a professor in the Department of Accountancy and Finance at Sabargamaba University of Sri Lanka. After serving 17 years in the industry, he joined academia, and he is a pioneer in applying triangulation research approaches in the management discipline. He is currently serving as the co-auditor-in-chief of the South Asian Journal of Marketing, published by Emerald Publishing, senior associate editor of the FIIB Business Review, published by Sage Publishing, managing editor of the South Asian Journal of Tourism and Hospitality, published by the Faculty of Management Studies. And he would be throwing insights on the rationale for selecting methodology for your research. I'm sure that given his expertise and enriching experience, it will be utmost beneficial for all the young researchers to know how to go ahead with research methodology when it comes to your own research. So I pass on this virtual dais to Dr. Jayanta Devashri.
Good afternoon, everyone. Dr. Nirma, can you share my PPT?
Yes, sure. Is it, can you say it?
Yes.
Okay.
It shows Griffith University on the background.
Okay. I think now it's the PowerPoint.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it is visible now.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Nirma. Very good afternoon, everyone. I consider it as a great pleasure and honor for me to participate in the International Research Symposium on the importance of marketing research in the 21st century, hosted by Jindal Global Business School, along with my colleagues, Professor Nirma Jayavardhana, Dr. Isuru Praswate, and Dr. Charita Pereira. As academics and researchers, we contribute to the globe through knowledge creation and dissemination. Marketing research that can be considered as an essential tool for knowledge creation, and we use classroom activities and also this kind of symposia for knowledge dissemination. So that, first of all, I appreciate the commendable effort put forward by the OP Jindal Global University in bundling knowledge creation and dissemination through a research symposia, which is beneficial for researchers and academicians worldwide. Marketing research that can be considered as an essential tool for global businesses today. It helps basically to identify consumer needs, product development and testing, and it helps throughout the entire marketing process. When you conduct your marketing research, there should be a strong justification for the selected methodology. Marketing research without an appropriate methodology, that is like an argument without a base. Therefore, we should understand the ways and means of applying each methodology before conducting our research. That is really essential. So, at the end of this plenary discussion, you will be able to understand the rationale for selecting qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method research designs. This session is basically based on a research paper we published in the International Journal of Qualitative Methods, published by Sage Publishing. So in this paper, we discuss the rationale for methodology selection for finance research, but we apply that knowledge to the marketing domain today. Next slide, Nirma. Before discussing the rationale, we should have a prior understanding of the research design as we discuss the rationale for each design. Research designs are the plans for addressing research questions. Consequently, that direct the procedures in conducting your research. For an example, it includes the steps from broad assumptions to detailed methods of data collection and analysis, so that research design that is devoted to translate a research problem into data for analysis, so as to provide relevant answers to research questions we do have at our hand. Next slide. Now we are going to discuss what do you mean by a research design. So it basically includes the components mentioned in the desktop. You can see on the screen. So first, it defines the information needed. So here you need to be specific on what information needed. In addition to that, you have to be specific on the overall research design, whether the research is exploratory, descriptive, or causal phase of research. Here we are going to link the research question to the research choice, strategies, or research approaches in the research onion. So it is essential to link your research question or research objective to the applied research choice or strategies or research approaches in your domain. In addition to that, so it indicates the construct measurement in a quantitative study. For an example, it includes the development of the questionnaire in a quantitative study and interview protocol in a qualitative study. Then you have to be specific with regard to the sampling process and sampling sizes. In addition to that, you should be specific on the data collection. And last, you have to develop a plan for the data analysis. So these are the basic contents of the research design. When we look at the type of research designs, there are three types of basic research designs. Those are qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method research. Qualitative research, that is a methodology for investigating and understanding social or human issue, and it deals with exploring a phenomenon which is under the inductive and theory building approach. So as I stated, qualitative, that is dealing with exploratory, and exploration is required for a qualitative research. When we discuss about a quantitative approach, that is a methodology for testing target hypothesis by inspecting the relationship among variables, that is deductive in nature. So these variables thus can be estimated regularly on instruments so that numbered information can be broken down utilizing statistical approaches. When we consider about the mixed method, the third column, so that is a way to deal with the seek request, including gathering both quantitative and qualitative data, coordinating the two types of information, and utilizing particular plans that may include philosophical presumptions and hypothetical systems, basically. So the mixed method approach preferably depends on a pragmatic view the philosophical perspective. As you can see on the screen, there are different research design under each approach. If you consider about quantitative research designs, you can see under the experimental, we can see through experiment and quasi experiments are there. If you consider through experiment, so here there is a control group in this experiment, and the participants, they are basically selected on random basis. Quasi experiment, they also do have a control group, but the participants are not selected by a random process. If you consider about non-experimental, we can see there are three research designs under this. So as you know, survey research, causal comparative research, and correlational designs are available. If you consider qualitative research designs, case studies, narrative research, phenomenological approach, grounded theory, ethnography, action research, that is available under the qualitative designs. When we consider about mixed method designs, so as mentioned by Creswell in 2009, based on 4 criterions, they basically derive these 6 major designs under the mixed method design. These 4 criteria were timing, weighting, mixing, and theorizing. Based on these 4 criterion, Creswell, they derived 6 major research designs under the mixed method design. So these are sequential explanatory research design, sequential exploratory design. If you consider sequential explanatory, so here what is happening is quantitative research followed up by the qualitative approach. In the sequential exploratory design, the other way around, qualitative followed up by the quantitative approach. In the sequential transformative design, so there is a sequence in between qualitative and quantitative approaches. In the meantime, theoretical perspectives or theoretical lenses plays a major role. In addition to that, we can see concurrent triangulation strategy, concurrent embedded strategy, concurrent transformative strategy. These are the 6 major designs derived by Creswell. In addition to this, there can be other approaches as well. So these 4 criterion that not reflect the, ultimate total research designs. There can be more than that. That's why the researchers across the world, they are coming up with different mixed method designs for their domains. So now we are going to discuss about what is the rationale for selecting the research design. So the research decision, that is often start with the reviewing literature in order to explore the research gaps, and then it is possible to derive specific research questions or objectives. So here we have to understand one thing. So if the phenomenon being investigated, that is not investigated in the past, and there is a requirement for a further exploration, so our decision is to go ahead with the exploration that require a induction or exploratory approach. So here we need to have a qualitative approach. But if the phenomenon is being investigated in the past and there is a specific, literature or empirical literature with regard to the phenomenon being investigated, we can proceed with hypothesis testing and proceed with a quantitative design. So research questions or objectives, that is mainly guiding the which research designs to be selected. So as I stated, basically selection of research methodology that is driven by your research questions or objectives. In addition to the research problem or research objectives or research questions, researchers' interest, competency, experience, resource availability, and audience that play a significant role in selection of the right research design. First, previous slide. First, I would like to discuss researchers' experience, competency. In addition to that, resource availability and audience as the rationale. Then we will discuss how research question or objective guide the selection of the research design. So here I would like to argue that researchers' own preparations, their perceptions, interests, experiences, and competencies matter when selecting of the methodology. So an individual prepared in specialized logical composition and quantitative aspects acquainted with quantitative journals would doubtlessly pick the quantitative research design. In addition to that, if you consider researchers who appreciate writing in artistic way, leading individual meetings, or mentioning very close objective facts may include towards the qualitative research design. So the blended strategies scientist is an individual acquainted with both qualitative and quantitative, both quantitative and subjective examination. So in addition to that, resource availability, that also plays a crucial role when selecting the right research design. So the reason is that, so if you consider about some research designs such as mixed method design that require more resources and time. In addition to that, researchers compose for audience basically that will acknowledge their research. These audiences might be journal editors, faculty committees, conferences, meeting participants, or colleagues in the field. The encounters of these crowds with quantitative, qualitative, or blended strategies can shape the choice settled on about the decision of methodology selection. So the authors, they write for these audiences. For an example, if you consider a journal like Qualitative Research in Marketing, so that the audience basically that is based on qualitative, so that you will think about the audience and write for them. So if you consider a finance journal like Qualitative Research in Financial Markets, so they write qualitative for financial markets. So this is the audience. Next slide. So next, I'm going to discuss on the research questions. So I have emphasized that at last I'm going to discuss on the research questions and how it will guide for the right research methodology selection. So now we are going to discuss on the research questions that may pave the way towards a quantitative inquiry. So the research problems or questions that need a quantitative inquiry that can basically fall into 4 categories. It can be descriptive, comparative, relationship bounded, or historical. So if you are going through the research paper which we have published on International Journal of Qualitative Methods, as I stated at the beginning of the session, so you will have more information than this presentation. So you can go through at a lesser time. So what sort of research questions we can include under the quantitative inquiry. So as I stated, under the quantitative, there are 4 types of research questions we can see in the marketing domain as well. So descriptive research questions that seek quantitative analysis on more than one variable. Usually the question that start with what fall under the descriptive category. For an example, what are the determinants of consumer acceptance? In addition to that, what are the factors affecting consumer decision making? That could be considered as descriptively bounded research questions that need a quantitative inquiry. So as I stated, what sort of questions that is coming under the descriptive kind of research approach that need a quantitative inquiry. In addition to that, we can see what sort of questions. Questions start with what, that is also coming under qualitative paradigm as well. So if what sort of a question is require a further exploration, so that need a qualitative inquiry. So we will discuss that form under the qualitative inquiry as well. So the comparative category of research questions or problem that basically compare and or to differ one or more variables among 2 or more groups. For an example, what is the difference in the level of statistic anxiety between undergraduate male and female marketing students? That exemplifies the comparative nature of quantitatively bounded research problem or questions. The third type, that is the relationship nature. So relationship nature, it is argued that this type of questions include words such as relate, relationship, association, friend, influence in developing research questions or problems. For an example, when we investigate the relationship between advertising and sales performance, influence on advertising expenditure on marketing performance, so that reflect the relationship nature of quantitatively weighted research design. So the requirement is quantitative research design. So the last type, that is the historical type of research questions or objectives that predict the future through the past information. For an example, if you consider about past expenditure on advertising on the marketing performance, the past investment on research and development on current marketing performance, that exemplify such historically based research questions. Next slide, Nirma. Here you can see 2 articles we published based on a descriptively based research questions. That is basically based on quantitatively weighted finance research. What are the determinants of dividend policy? Both of these articles are published in Managerial Finance, one of the oldest prestigious journals published by Emerald Publishing. Next slide, Nirma. Now we are going to discuss about the rationale for a qualitative inquiry. So as I stated earlier, qualitative inquiry that is undertaken when not much is known about the situation at hand and no information is available on how similar problems have been solved in the past, and to get better understanding or clarity and insight on a phenomenon. So the research questions that have qualitative leanings that discourse on how and what questions. So as I stated earlier, so what sort of questions we use under the quantitative paradigm as well. That is coming under the descriptive nature of research questions. But under the qualitative paradigm also we can see what sort of questions. The questions start with what form. The questions start with what form in the qualitative inquiry that require exploration. So that is the main difference here. In addition, the research questions which start with why word are required in a qualitative inquiry that deals with human interactions. So I would like to highlight that qualitative research designs are evolving. Those are open-ended and those are non-directional. And case study, phenomenology, ethnography, narrative research are the main types of them. You could remember under the research design, we discussed some strategies and some research designs under the qualitative inquiry. For an example, so research questions, if you take research questions like, why do companies pay dividends? How do marketing managers select their marketing team? So that require a kind of exploration. So what finance or marketing decisions lead to a sustainably oriented culture in an organization? And what does it mean to teachers to win a teachers awards in marketing? That require a qualitative inquiry since they are qualitatively weighted in nature. In addition to that, I see a common mistake in developing research questions. Some researchers, they state their research questions using do, does, is, and are terms. Not only in the undergraduate research, but also in the postgraduate research, MBAs, a lot of DBAs and PhDs, they basically use these terms in order to create their or design their research problems or questions. So here I would like to emphasize that the researchers should not start the research questions with the words using terms such as does, do, is, and are, since they are leading to yes or no obvious answers. If the research question is leading to obvious answers, so there is no requirement for a such investigation. So I can remember that one of the leading mixed methodologies, Ombuasi, he stated that the researchers, they should not use these terms as these type of research questions are leading to yes and no obvious answers. So that paper also basically discuss about the rationale for research design, rationale for selection of the methodology. So I have shared that paper is also with Nirma. Nirma, you can later share these PPT along with the base paper and the paper I just stated with the audience. So for better understanding and clarity.
Yeah, yes, sure. I will share it.
So next, we are going to discuss about rationale for a mixed method inquiry. So as you can see, this is our base paper. So I have attached in this screen also on the rationale for methodology selection. So in this paper, we discuss the rationale for mixed method in detail. You can go through this paper when you have a time. This is freely available. So this is an open access journal, International Journal of Qualitative Methods. You can go through this paper in order to understand what is the rationale for mixed method and also qualitative and quantitative inquiry. Next slide, Nirma. So the research questions that need a triangulated or mixed method inquiry that is combined with both qualitative and quantitative aspects. Whether these two phases are sequential, embedded or concurrent, that is depending on 4 criteria as I stated earlier. That is namely timing, weighting, mixing and theorizing. For an example, when determining the impact of investor sentiment on asset price movement, it is imperative to get information about both investor sentiment that is qualitative in nature and that is the independent variable, and stock price movement if you take, that is quantitative in nature and that is the dependent variable. So here, in order to understand the investor sentiment, it is not easy to investigate the sentiment using a quantitative inquiry. So in the qualitative phase, the investor's overall attitude that is coming under the marketing domain. So how attitude or how sentiment toward a particular stock price movement could be determined by developing an instrument through interviews. Here we have to develop an instrument in order to measure the overall attitude regarding a particular stock price movement. So investor sentiment, there are some proxies in the finance domain in order to investigate, in order to measure. But the reality can be different from the proxy explanations. We see it as a major serious flaw in the finance domain. So that in order to investigate the investor sentiment or overall attitude, there is a requirement for a qualitative inquiry. So in using qualitative in-depth interviews, what we can do is we can develop an instrument in order to measure that concept. So then in the quantitative phase, it is possible to investigate the relationship between attitude and the level of price movement through a survey, because we do have already developed instrument in order to measure the overall attitude of the investors. So here the overall research design is sequential because the qualitative phase is followed by the quantitative phase. So first we conducted the qualitative phase in order to develop an instrument in order to measure the investors' overall attitude. So further, it shows that a higher weightage here is given for the qualitative phase. Previous slide, Nirma. So here the factors such as timing, that is qualitative followed by the quantitative approach, and weightage, that is supported in determining the suitable research design, that is sequential exploratory in nature, qualitative followed up by the quantitative phase. So there are research questions that need a sequential explanatory design as well. Sequential explanatory in the sense quantitative followed up by the qualitative phase. So for an example, for addressing a research question like what is the difference in perceived barriers to reading empirical marketing research articles between graduate students with low level of reading comprehension and high level of reading comprehension. So here a sequential explanatory design is needed. Why? What is the reason? Because first we need to administer test of reading comprehension. We need to do a test in order to understand the reading comprehension. So we have to rank the comprehension scores of individual students, and then we have to purposefully select students who are high level. So then we can interview them using a purposive sampling technique. So here the first approach is quantitative. So here what we are doing is we are using a quantitative test in measuring the reading comprehension, and it is followed by a qualitative approach in order to determine perceived barriers to reading empirical marketing research articles. Here it required a sequential explanatory design. So as you can see, research question always drives the selection of the right methodology, and nature of the research question, it drives the suitable methodology. So most of the time we can see that most of the researchers, they tend to select the methodology based on their basically competencies. So competencies can be considered as the second choice. First choice, that is the research question, objectives or nature of the research question. So we emphasize this in the research paper, base paper. So having some articles, doing a systematic literature review, identifying some lagging areas in the domain. So we emphasize the rationale based on those articles. So next, we are going to discuss about the rationale for other triangulation approaches. If you consider the triangulation, other triangulation approaches, are there any other approaches other than qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method approaches? So there is a question. Yes, there are some other research choices. So these are the research choices coming under the research onion. You can see there are some research choices such as monomethod, multi-method, mixed method. So monomethod in the sense that use of a single methodology. So either qualitative or quantitative. Mixed method, that is the use of both quali and quanti method. So you can see there is another term called multi-method. So under the multi-method, we can discuss the data triangulation or within the method triangulation. Within the method triangulation. Data triangulation in the sense that use of two or more similar type of data sources in a single study that can be in terms of person, space, and time. So we can have variations based on time, space, and person. So for an example, assume that you are going to do a research using a survey by surveying both consumers and marketing professionals. So there is a person variation in this study. So there are two samples here you can see. So both consumers and the marketing professionals, their views on something. Their views on something. So what you can do, you can take it under the data triangulation approach. So that is the person triangulation. Time, space, and person. It can be either time triangulation. I could remember that we have done a research study based on a time triangulation. That is the first time in the finance history we have conducted a time triangulation for a finance research. So what we have done was we have taken both published data in the published annual statements, annual financial data, and also we have parallelly conducted a survey in order to investigate the same research problem. So then finally we triangulated the findings and we discussed, we have done a comprehension of the study. So that is a time triangulation, because if you take financial statements, this data that can be from 2000 to 2020. But if you consider about survey data, that can be taken in 2020 or 2021 or 2022. If you are doing the research right now, it can be the current pace, 2022. So here, the time is different. Time is different. That is coming under the time triangulation. But you have to remember that longitudinal studies are different from the time triangulation, because longitudinal studies, the purpose is different. In addition to the data triangulation, so there are other triangulation approaches like investigator triangulation. Here what you are doing is you are taking different investigators, different data collectors, different investigators, different data analysis in the same research. What you can do is you can separately analyze the results of these investigators, and finally you can triangulate the findings of these two approaches. In addition to that, we can see theoretical triangulation. Theoretical triangulation is the use of multiple theories in a single approach. Here you have to basically understand that the same set of theories which has similar set of assumptions can be triangulated. All the complementary theories, not the competing theories, because they are, if you consider about the assumptions, that is different. If you consider about competing theories. So if you are taking similar set of theories, that may have similar set of assumptions when developing those theories. So theoretical triangulation that provide multiple theoretical lenses in order to see a problem from two or more different angles. Multiple triangulation in the sense that use of multiple theories, multiple triangulation approaches in a single research. For an example, you can have data triangulation and investigative triangulation in a single research. Data triangulation and methodological triangulation, that is mixed method, in a single research. So there is a rationale for selection of these approaches as well. If you consider data triangulation, for an example, if you see that there are some contradictions over the phenomenon across the past decade using a similar approach, what you can do? You can triangulate the results in a single study. So in a single study, you can have a confirmation. So then you will ask, what will happen if the results are different? So what you have to do? Here what you have to do is you have to reinvestigate the phenomenon, reinvestigate the whole research process in terms of variables, indicators, coding, contextual validation. It should be investigated. So assume that still there are contradictions, you can interpret as new insights to the phenomenon. So if you consider about investigator triangulation, for an example, so if there are some investigator biases, so what you can do? You can do an investigator triangulation in order to minimize the investigator biases. So there is a rationale for these as well. So when you are writing your methodology chapter in your thesis, dissertation, or in your research paper, you have to remember that the justification for the methodology, that is essential, not only for the justification of methodology, but also for the justification of the models selected, justification for the statistical techniques used, that is essential. So I think I do have 3 to 4 minutes more. So in these two papers, we basically investigated the dividend policy and corporate governance in Sri Lanka using the data triangulation approach, and it was published in Qualitative Research in Financial Markets by Emerald Publishing. This utilizes the data triangulation approach. So there was a rationale, there is a contradiction, not only in the different contexts, but also in similar contexts. We can see differences are there by using the quantitative approach, the published data. So we proceeded with the data triangulation approach. So the second paper, That is basically published in the Journal of Public Affairs. So published by Willie. So here also we proceeded with the data triangulation approach. So this is the last but not least slide of the presentation today. So I'm going to summarize within the course of next 2 minutes. So as a summary, I would like to emphasize that it mostly the research question that lead for the selection of right research design. In addition to that, you have to consider researchers' interest, competencies, and experience. And as I stated at the beginning, resource availability and audience also play a crucial role in selection of a research approach. So in addition to that, I would like to recommend that the justification is required not only for the broader methodologies like quantitative, qualitative, and mixed method, but as I stated earlier, for the models you have established, statistical methods or tools and other relevant approaches you present in the methodology or data analysis sections of your manuscript or your research study. So that justification should be there. For an example, if you have a binary variable or a dichotomous scale variable as the dependent variable, so you can proceed with either probit model or logit model under the analysis. So if you are using probit model, there should be a justification. You have to highlight that why you have selected probit, why it is superior than logit. So what are the reasons? So that justification should be there. So this is not only with regard to the selection of broader methodologies such as quali, quanti, and mixed methodologies, but also with regard to the selection of models or statistical tools you use in this study. So with that note, I would like to conclude my talk. We will have a discussion after the remaining subsequent sessions, and I would like to thank Dr. Nirma and the team for inviting me in order to deliver this plenary speech. Have a good day. So we will discuss the questions during the Q&A session.
Thank you so much, Professor Jayanta Devashri. I think it has been one of the insightful talks that most of the researchers and young aspirants are looking forward to write a research paper would always want. Emphasis on the researcher's interest, competency, experience definitely plays a vital role, and your entire presentation was definitely linked and connected with these aspects. Thank you very much for this talk. Moving forward, we now have talk by Professor Isuru Koswate. Dr. Isuru Koswate is an assistant professor at the University of the West of Scotland, UWS, in the School of Business and Creative Industries. He also is an adjunct senior research fellow at NSBM Green University and a member of the Academy of International Business, AIB. He is a director of Le Carquet, one of the biggest novelty gift and souvenir shopping malls in Asia, located in the heart of Colombo, Sri Lanka. Today, Dr. Koswate would be putting insights on understanding the dark side of digital transformation of exams, a higher educational perspective. And I think all the faculty members who have joined are definitely going to connect with some of the challenges that we have faced. So passing on the virtual dais to Dr. Isuru Koswate.
Thank you very much, Meenakshi, and thank you very much again for Dr. Nirma and the team for giving me this opportunity to speak a few words on a few interesting topics. So again, in terms of the symposium, what I was thinking is when I was going to pick a sort of a topic, I felt this had more sort of relevance because it was kind of a sort of a topic or an exploration that we did very recently, again, targeting the Wine Journal of Information and Knowledge Management Systems. And yes, so let me share my presentation first of all. Okay. Right. So yes. Perfect. I hope you can see the screen. Okay.
Yes, it's visible.
Perfect. Yes. So in terms of how the sort of idea came about was that, again, I have again previously done some research when it's surrounding educational studies, but again, one of the sort of challenges as an academic who was sort of coming from, again, from Sri Lanka, and now who has someone moved to the UK, one thing that we felt is that the online education sphere has really sort of taken over. Again, whether it is something of a topic or something of a development that we sort of expected, or whether it was sort of fast forwarded, was something that was quite interesting. So in terms of how this topic developed, I would say in terms of the background, as we all know, the global pandemic situation has really been one of the key factors or key reasons as to why there has been many changes across many fields, but something that is very relevant for all of us is the higher educational sort of area. And again, one thing that we have seen is that despite the changes in higher education happening to online and the kind of digital transformation much before the global pandemic, with the pandemic sort of taking over daily lives and the way students were learning, the shift happened in a sort of a non-organic way. So it was sort of fast forwarded. Things were led by sort of more of desperation, I would say, rather than a natural progression. So that sort of was quite an interesting phenomenon that happened. Whether you liked it or not, it sort of had to happen. And again, if we look at the general way in how things have changed, I would say the pandemic is one of those very rare kind of instances or crises that has had a global impact, which we have not seen quite recently. And the effects obviously have a sort of an imbalance, especially if you look at the Western context, where countries are inherently, I would say, resource rich, and in a sort of a global South context where there are more fundamental issues that needed addressing, again, even before the pandemic. So things like food security, the rising poverty, and on top of that, if you are sort of expected to change into a sort of an online kind of platform and the kind of interfaces to be developed, it automatically causes more of a skewed impact when it comes to the sort of emerging nations. And so what this also means is that not only the fact that the sort of digital transformation fast forwarded leads to certain cracks opening up or certain vulnerabilities in certain systems, but at the same time, the sort of emerging nations are sort of impacted more heavily with their more fundamental issues. So this is where we were sort of interested in terms of looking at how this sort of shift into, or the lack of preparation people had and the individuals had when it comes to the shift, how this sort of leads to an integral sort of system. Again, online education is a big component that we have seen. Now, again, if I was to give an example, in the UK, we are now slowly seeing students physically coming back to universities. So for the past 2 years, things have been online, and whether this is an approach that we should be taking forward, because now we see a lot of universities appointing administrative staff when it comes to, let's say, things like blended learning or sort of hybrid learning mechanisms. So one thing that we can see is that the sort of online education is a system that is there to stay. It's not something that will disappear. So one thing we need to then start looking at is, okay, in the past 2 years, this rapid shift or the transformation did happen, but did it happen in the right way? Did we miss any kind of gaps in the sort of system that needs to sort of alter and that needs to be worked on, is where I think the interesting component lies. So based on these kind of background information, what we sort of identified is that many of the sort of online education and the kind of practices that were developed were predominantly from a Western context. Again, one might argue and say there was not enough time to really adopt certain practices to other contexts or other cultures. So as soon as a new system or an interface or a sort of a platform was developed, you didn't have much time to really look at these contexts to adopt to other cultures. So, however, since most of the systems and the sort of interfaces were developed and coming from a Western interface, I think there is a significant requirement to see to what extent some of these sort of systems can be actually implemented directly in a sort of an emerging nation perspective. And another thing that we sort of realized in terms of the sort of ideas surrounding sort of online education was that in terms of the stakeholders involved, again, we know that we are talking about the educational institutes, universities themselves who play a key role. We have other organizations or the government maybe providing, or the education ministries and so forth, which is sort of facilitating certain changes that are happening. And again, there seems to be a tendency for many of these sort of policies developed to almost skip one of the most important stakeholders, which is the learners themselves. Again, as much as again, as academics, I think you might agree that we develop many of these curriculums, many of the practices. However, the sort of world is slowly, especially in a Western context, I have personally experienced this quite heavily, where we are obviously moving away from a teacher-centered approach to this sort of student-centered or the learner-based kind of approach. So there needs to be a significant emphasis placed on the students themselves, which is something that we have found lacking, especially in a Sri Lankan context, where which is again heavily known for its sort of teacher-centered approach and the very traditional and orthodox ways in which teaching does happen. So this online transformation of education is a big challenge, not only for the universities themselves, but academics themselves, who need to really sort of move out of their comfort zone to a certain extent, I would use that word, and then sort of integrate these kind of changes with the students themselves. So I think this is where the kind of ideas started to emerge in terms of why this topic or why this particular area was important for us to look at. So again, the sort of research that in itself is quite, I would say, straightforward in this scenario, again, since it is more of a sort of phenomenon or sort of evidence-based kind of research. So the key question that we wanted to tackle was, again, take this sort of student-centered, learner-centered approach and to understand what their perceptions of online exams was. Again, when we talk about education in itself, it is quite a broader area, but we wanted to focus on online exams or assessments, which I will explain why in terms of the literature as we go along. And the two key objectives that we wanted to look at is firstly to identify the key factors that influence the student perception, and secondly, we wanted to look at how these sort of possible interrelationships between some of these factors that we have identified. So then sort of looking at where the literature stands here, one thing that we have seen again, time and time again, is that the changes that were happening was forceful, and many of the changes, whether it was the institutions themselves, whether it was the lecturers or the staff themselves, were not 100% convinced with some of the changes. So that can be due to many reasons. Again, if you are coming from a very traditional teaching kind of background, the kind of interfaces and the learning environment was unfamiliar for you, so you felt a little out of place. And again, due to the fact that there was not enough time invested in certain systems to be tested, tried and tested, I think there was a lot of room for vulnerabilities. And at the same time, certain adoption of some of the online interfaces in certain parts of the world, especially when we talk about South Asian and especially Sri Lankan context, there were key challenges surrounding laboratory work, practical applications, and again, these things were due to lack of technology, lack of access to resources like virtual reality and the kind of facilities available in the universities. So the key sort of message that repeatedly was coming through from the literature that we see is that one size fits all cannot be the solution for online transition. And I want to stress this quite heavily, the fact that this is something that was coming through much earlier than the pandemic was happening as well. So many of the online systems transformations were happening in universities. However, there was a strong need to sort of adopt practices in a more of a local context before actually implementing and applying some of the practices. So based on this, why we sort of use the term dark side for our sort of topic was the fact that the dark side is able to capture the sort of malpractices and the room for manipulation of an existing system. And here our focus mainly revolved around assessment, because assessment is a key component in everywhere, because students were getting, that is the way in which students were sort of acknowledged in terms of their performances. And if the systems of assessment are not really thorough, or if they are not robust enough, I think that leaves a lot of doubt in terms of existing students who have gone through, as well as other wider community, whether we are actually doing things in the right way, despite the difficulties of the pandemic and so forth. And again, something that was stemming, or something that we slowly saw that was coming through with the literature, was that the fact that some of the sort of malpractices surrounding online education was actually coming from certain fields. For example, there were some differences that was existing, especially from a Western context, where we see the sort of the STEM subjects or the STEM field students compared to the business students. I think there was some differences. So I think that was, again, one thing that was really interesting for us to really examine, to see what sort of led to these kind of differences in terms of the different subject fields. So in terms of what we did in terms of methodology and the sample, we were mainly looking at the university students studying in Sri Lanka. And again, the study areas were sort of the business and the STEM kind of fields. And before we actually went out and did the sort of survey, we had an initial pilot testing round with, again, around 12 members of the education field, which included students, so that we had sort of a clear picture in terms of what was happening before we actually went out and did the survey. And again, the survey was developed based on some of the previous scales, again, which was already quite strong in terms of how online education systems were adopted. So some of the works that we used were Hillier, Khalaf, and Khan, for example, quite recent work in terms of very robust scales that was existing. And based on the kind of existing scales that we identified, we looked at dimensions like reliability, practicality, pedagogy, attitude, as well as security when it comes to online exams and assessments. So in terms of what we were able to gather from this kind of piece of work was quite intriguing. One of the things, again, in terms of sample, we looked at around 127 students, and in terms of it was sort of 50-50 male, female. And again, the median age group was 20 to 22. So again, it was mostly sort of students who were in their sort of first year, second year, as well as some in their third year as well. And again, majority of the students that we gathered were from the business field, as you can see from this slide. So again, in terms of the initial kind of analysis, what we sort of found out was that majority of the sort of students, or majority of the scores, were in the sort of middle. People were sort of having mixed feelings, I would say, in terms of the key aspects that we're looking at, which sort of coincides to a certain extent with what was seen previously. So people, in certain extents, they had certain understandings pretty much, for example, about how online examinations were sort of more robust against cheating, how online examinations was providing sort of convenience and the practicality. People could log in, people could access some of the sort of materials in their own comforts. The convenience was there. So there were certain significant positives that we were seeing, but at the same time, people were strongly showing sort of a neutral as well as mixed feelings about the overall online examination process. And again, as I said before, from the literature, one thing that was stemming was the fact that whether we want to see whether there are actual difference that we were able to gather from especially the business and the STEM fields. And based on our analysis, we couldn't find a statistical sort of significance. And this sort of led to us to sort of consider the entire respondent group as one single group. And that sort of allowed us to then further navigate and explore the data in detail to see whether there was actually any sort of correlations that was coming between the already developed dimensions. And one of the things that we saw initially was that the sort of scores that were developed, we saw some sort of reliability in terms of in certain some correlation with factors like reliability and security, and the three other factors, practicality, pedagogy, and attitude, had their sort of own correlation amongst themselves. So it almost sort of guided us towards a certain direction, which was interesting. And based on this, what we sort of did was that it was very clear that the data was showing us that the dimensions needed to be reduced. Again, we were pushed in terms of more of a principal component analysis, where we were able to identify two key factors based on the results themselves. So factor one, we identified as trustworthiness. So trustworthiness is something that was, again, developed based on the initial round of identification of reliability and security of online examinations. And the second factor is what we call as apprehensible education. So that is a combination of pedagogy's practicality as well as attitude that was coming through, which showed sort of a significant amount of correlation. So what does this all mean in terms of our sort of discussion is, I think, where you are interested in. And what we see quite interesting based on the discussion is that, first of all, STEM and business students showing similar opinions about online examinations and the vulnerabilities does contradict to a certain extent with previous literature, where previous literature does show that online examinations or online systems have a certain amount of cheating that can happen, where maybe certain groups are more likely to cheat or not. But again, one of the things that we saw with this kind of result was that although Sarkar's study was focusing on exams themselves, there was another study that was looking at online interfaces and the vulnerabilities. So again, since we were only focusing on examination component or the assessment component, we agree to a certain extent why there might be more of a diverging opinion from the literature. And the mixed feelings about online examinations, again, replacing physical examinations was something that was coming out, which again corresponds quite clearly to the confusion and the perplexity surrounding students. Again, this is something that was already existing quite strongly or quite obviously before the pandemic, but I think once the pandemic situation sort of really took over, this point was really coming through, because people were still unsure to what extent online systems and the examination process really helps them in terms of really understanding the entire system in place. And again, based on the principal component analysis, the trustworthiness dimension that was derived also corresponds to some literature from the past about online examinations and students, because for example, the work of Muzaffar et al. 2021 highlights security and reliability, which were two initial factors or dimensions that we identified from literature, should not be left without one another. So that means security and reliability when it comes to online education and examinations should go hand in hand. So that sort of again corresponds pretty well with what we see with the results, because trustworthiness is sort of a dimension that we developed based on the initial round of dimensions, which was security and reliability. Again, I think this is an interesting scenario to further work on. And again, the apprehensible education also is an important component, because it highlights the need for pedagogies. Pedagogies is the sort of examinations or sort of teaching methods to be practical. And why this is important is because students, in terms of the attitudes, the results do show students do expect online education or assessments or examinations to have something different. Their expectations of online examinations is much more different than physical examinations. So their attitude and their changes are expecting that. So that is why we also believe when it comes to online pedagogies and especially examinations, there needs to be I would say a revamped or more of a refreshed thought process in the universities with academics into how they can really make an online examination, not to take the physical examination and then simply plug it in as an online exam, but really rethink the process in terms of the benefits of online examinations, what is good, what is bad, and then sort of do a customized kind of system in place. And what does this mean in terms of the long term? In terms of the long term, what we can see is that, again, one of the key implications that we wanted to sort of examine with this initial study was that we wanted to not only look at sort of student perceptions of online examinations, but we wanted to take into account emerging nations, again, the context of Sri Lanka, which has its own set of challenges, which is inherently resource constrained, and what sort of what that means for students who are facing examinations. And this helps us to actually build this scenario, because the dark side of online examinations is a topic that is still emerging, I would say, because we are now slowly coming out of a pandemic. So this is the time where people have the opportunity, or researchers have the opportunity, to really reflect on the past 2 years and think about what was good, what is bad. And this is where I think the ideas or the kind of literature is now slowly trying to build and emerge. Most of the existing work that we have taken into account here was built based on sort of the scales that was done quite before the pandemic. And I think this gives more room for greater research to now examine things in a more exploratory way to build this idea further, because it's very important not to simply look at the kind of developments of education or assessments from a Western perspective where it is developed. You have to acknowledge that. But now, since we are sort of broadly applying it to other contexts, especially the emerging nations and the developing countries, I think working on this round helps us to get a much more of a broader picture and the realistic scenario and the practicalities when it comes to application in certain countries and locations. So this means that, again, for policymakers and practitioners, there's a clear need to adopt to the local specific systems, as much as we recognize the Western strategies, but we need to really localize certain practices as well. And again, especially this is very important from, again, a South Asian perspective, where students are almost not considered as a very important stakeholder. I mean, although things are changing, I think this needs to be recognized, especially with policymakers as well as universities, to really need to understand students are actually a central point. And again, since student-centered learning systems are now emerging and is being recognized as a more effective way in which education needs to be developed in the future for engagement and for greater understanding, I think there needs to be more emphasis being placed on students and how they perceive some of the changes and take them into account when certain decisions or certain changes are being made. So again, in terms of the limitations of this particular study, again, this was a study that was sort of done based on the sort of emerging phenomena. And I think there needs to be a greater or wider audience to be expanded to understand in detail about whether business and STEM fields do have some significant differences emerging, because we do see some things emerging from other contexts, maybe a greater sort of an exploratory work surrounding this area which is now emerging, I think would make a lot of sense to have a better understanding of the different fields and how they can be addressed. And again, we only focused on the assessment component, not necessarily on the wider education sector in place. So I think that is something that again needs to be done. Again, we can take this into account. Greater studies or new studies can look at other components like the curricula and how certain things can be developed with a more of a student-centric approach. And again, this is where I think the exploratory work needs to come into place. I think more work needs to be done, especially to nail down the individual component, because if students are, again, something that we see in this particular work was students having this mixed feelings about examination. So I think great exploratory work to understand their individual feelings, their kind of individual attitudes would really help us to gain more insights and deeper understandings of the changes and the challenges coming with online education. So yes, I hope you managed to find this useful. I know that I kept it quite short, and I would welcome any questions that would come after. And thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kuswate. I think it's been a wonderful journey to see the kind of challenges, to kind of see the implications, and yes, the necessity of future work definitely will unfold many more dimensions to this particular problem that you've tried addressing. Moving forward, we now have a talk by Professor Charita Harshini Pereira. Just to give a brief introduction about Dr. Charita Harshini Pereira, she's a lecturer in marketing at Department of Marketing Operations and Systems at the Northumbria University, UK. She obtained her PhD in business, specializing in marketing communication, with recognition for outstanding work for our MIT University. She has received a college scholarship for her outstanding performance from our MIT University. In today's panel discussion, she would be talking about transnational education remodeled, emerging issues and prospects. On that note, I hand over the virtual dais to Dr. Charita Harshini Pereira. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Meenakshi. And good afternoon, everyone. And first of all, let me thank Professor Nirma for inviting me and letting me to be part of this research symposium, which has organized under a very important theme, 21st century and market research. So first of all, I would share my screen. All right. So you probably know, as we all are in this higher education, that the higher education marketers, recruiters, and the communication professionals face challenges that didn't exist years ago. So this challenge is not unique to the higher education. But however, this fierce competition, network effects, and this fragmented media landscape have only poured fuel onto this fuel. Most universities have already accepted that things will never be the same. There's a massive opportunity for the universities to rise to this occasion, communicate with the impact, and share stories that show what makes the university genuinely unique. Both literally and figuratively, the answer to this challenge is not to do more, but to do better. But how exactly? So this is what the focus of the presentation today, which is on remodeling the transnational education. So this is the agenda of today's presentation. We are going to discuss a little bit about the transnational education and its relevancy to the marketization of higher education, and some categories and how this TNE has remodeled, and later the prospects of TNE. So what is this transnational education? What do you mean by transnational education? The world has never been flatter than today. In this digitally connected world, where these geographical margins are no longer relevant for the human interaction, the demand for education to be global or transnational is ever increasing. People no longer desire for just education. They seek to access global knowledge. In recent years, there has been a significant expansion of international partnerships and the collaborations between public and private higher education institutions. We all know that the state universities can only accommodate for a limited number of students, a limited number of new undergraduates every year. So what will happen to the rest of the students? They will need to search for an alternative. So this is where the alternative providers come into the play. In simple, transnational education, or the TNE, is the education delivered in a country other than the country in which the awarding institution is based. So for an example, a student based in country Y is studying for a degree program from a university in a country Z. So the clear attraction of bringing alternative providers into the higher education sector is that it increases the physical capacity of the system without the need to provide additional capital resources. It gives a greater choice and flexibility to parents and the students across the world who may not be able to afford or be willing to spend several years, thousands of miles away from the home. It provides a greater access to internationally recognized qualifications for thousands of students. So this TNE can be used as a marketing point of higher education institutions. This transnational education is a product of the marketization of higher education because it has kind of a competitive rush for the international students and their money. So new universities are being co-founded or co-developed by two or more universities from different countries are emerging as interesting alternatives to the international branch campus models. So during the last decade, the scope and the scale of higher education providers moving across the borders to offer academic programs and the qualifications in foreign countries have changed dramatically. So while twinning programs and international branch campuses have been the most common form of transnational education, there is an evolution, if not a revolution, in the development of new form of transnational education programs and collaborations. So this TNE, or the transnational education, has created a borderless university with courses and services being offered to the partner universities around the world, usually on offshore campuses. The interest in distant education continues to grow, and new approaches are being developed where the local host country support is being provided to distance education students. So there is no question that transnational education is a dynamic and increasingly complex part of marketization of higher education, and that new trends and the development need to be carefully monitored and analyzed. So this transnational education, which is the mobility of the education program and providers between the countries, has dramatically changed in their scope and the scale during the last decade. The new actors, new partnerships, new modes of delivery, and the new regulations are emerging. So this has resulted in a proliferation of transnational education terms and a mass confusion in how they are used. So over the last 10 years, the growth of the transnational education has been a major focus of attention for the many developed countries. During a period when international student recruitment has stagnated and the host countries has lost their market share, the transnational education has been widely seen as an alternative way of diversifying revenue and building international profile. If foreign students are increasingly unable or unwilling to come to the host country, then taking the education to the students in their home countries provides a way to keep enrollment growing. So when it comes to the Tne framework, we usually can find two categories: collaborative and independent provisions. So given the requirement that a common transnational education framework has to be useful and easily understood by different institutions and countries around the world. A fundamental factor is a delineation of whether Tne is a collaborative activity. That means they have kind of collaboration between the local and foreign providers, or whether the Tne provider is solely by foreign sending higher education institution or the provider, meaning they don't have any kind of relationship with the local higher education institutions. So this categorizes Tne activity in the host country as either as collaborative or an independent standalone activity. So the collaborative Tne. So the collaborative category means that foreign higher education institutions have a local partner with whom they are cooperating in terms of delivering the academic program. They have some kind of training programs, joint, double, or the multiple degree programs, and some locally supported distance education programs. In contrast, independent Tne, the second category. So from the host country perspective, that no local higher education institution provider is normally involved in designing or delivering the academic program. So they usually have some international branch campuses, franchise universities, distance education providers, and foreign private institutions. So the difference between these two categories of Tne activity has important implication for regulations and policies related to the registration, quality assurances, degree recognition, availability of the scholarships, and data collection for both host and sending countries. So by developing primary categories while identifying key elements and providing definition, it is possible to have a common understanding of the different mode of TNE, and furthermore, the ability to differentiate one type of TNE from another. However, this common TNE framework makes unproductive chaos and confusions about TNE terminologies. So this is where we wanted to remodel this TNE framework. So the purpose of remodeling the framework for TNE is to provide an analytical tool to understand a phenomena which is both growing in importance and evolving at a very rapid pace. So this framework is made to provide conceptual differences between the different form of or the types of TNE activities. So this framework provides an organizing principle which allow the different modes of TNE activities to be examined in terms of similarities and differences for both applications and the research purposes. Again, the reason for the remodeling the framework is a framework must make a sense from both conceptual and practical perspective. It needs to be relevant to both sending and the host countries, and it needs to be both robust and flexible so as to accommodate countries and institutions which are at varying stage of TNE development and have different rationale driving their TNE involvement. And again, language. Language is always a central but a complicating issue. But because of TNE always involved in different countries, the key element that differentiate one form of TNE from another must be clear enough to translate and understood by different languages. So this emphasizes the need for the clarity and consistency among the most often used TNE terms. So for an example, much meaning can be lost when a framework becomes too complex and the definitions are either too detailed. Too detailed means that the definitions are very generic and there is a room for the confusion. And some form of TNE activity are excluded because of this excessive specificity. However, the previous researchers have shown that the same challenges of clarity, conciseness, rigor, flexibility face the development of definition for the different form of student mobility, as well as the meaning of an international student. So while these points guide the development of a common TNE framework, they also present certain challenges. So when developing this model for the TNE, several theories have been used and explain TNE and the factors that promote its adoption in several countries. So in particular, social capital theory, neoliberalism, and institutional theory have been used to explain the TNE delivery in different contexts. However, the institutional theory follows a realistic ontology, which always explains the use of structure, practice, and belief based on normative expectation for accessibility in a social setting. So consequently, the institutional theory is based on the assumption that institutions are made of regulative, normative, and cultural cognitive elements that, together with associated activities and resources, provide stability and meaning to the social life. So this framework is focusing on three main domains that enhances the delivery of the quality of TNE in higher education institutions, the quality assurance standard and the processes, and the development of the competencies of academic staff, and finally, the students' experience. So the first major factor is the influence of the adoption of quality standards in TNE, licensing, reputation, and standard delivery. So the basic of legitimacy that represent the licensing, the indicators of the representation of certification and accreditation processes, and the basis for the order that define the rules by regulatory agencies and partners are essential for the institutional factors. Importantly, by way of regulation, licensing and quality assurance of cross-border programs, countries put in place a regulatory framework for assuring quality and providing accreditation to guide cross-border education delivery. So, growing expectation of employers for quality students to work in the industry, the demand for efficient use of public resources in higher education provision, and growing cross-border education provision is a challenge for higher education sector. However, the burden of ensuring that standards are maintained in TNE are often not on the partner alone, but on regulatory bodies and quality assurance agencies. However, one of the challenges of global partnership and network in higher education is in the respect of internal and external legitimacy concerns. So the reputation of higher education institution is an integral part of the internationalization of teaching and research, and if not properly managed, it could lead to an academic and reputational risk. So the next is the development of staff competencies. So in relation to the institutional theory, the development of staff competencies is linked to the basis of order, whether the a normative domain explains the binding expectations of partners through agreements that ensure that staff who teach have a required qualification and expertise. So one of the major challenges facing many TNE partnerships with regard to the teaching and learning practices is the lack of proper training for academic staff who teach the modules. So although there is a rise in TNE delivery, most academic staff are not trained to cope with the teaching and learning expectations. So the reflective practices and professional development remain relevant in higher education and the delivery of courses and the modules. And the next factor is on the student's experience. So the experience of the students in higher education institution is particularly essential for the development of their knowledge and skill that is also significant for the national economic development. The expectation and the perception of students with regard to the service they receive from providers of higher education is essential to quality education provisions and the outcome. So the students who do not indicate satisfaction in the service they receive and likely to report low student experience that could affect the future student enrollment. So when the voice of the students are not heard, it leads to an apathy cycle that adversely affects students' experiences. So while the challenges to providing students with a rich learning experience in TNE could be seen as certain aspects such as monitoring students' progression and retention and maintaining high assessment standards, because higher education institutions are required to uphold quality standards to avoid academic and reputational risks. So that is how we have remodeled the existing TNE framework by using the institutional theory and some latent variable coming from this regulative system, normative system, and cultural cognitive system. So you can find some of the examples here. So University of Nottingham, one of the famous university in UK. So they also involving with this TNE activities. Accordingly, they have certain universities in Asian countries, one in Malaysia, and there's another one in China. Likewise, most of the universities in developed countries, now they are moving toward the TNE activities to expand their borders. So the proposed TNE framework aims to start the conversation about the development of common a common set of Tne terms. So the uses and intended benefit of such framework are many. However, there are always potential risks and unintended consequences. So that we can focus on some of the benefits of the Tne. Increasingly, higher education institutions have a key role to play in developing a graduate cohort with a global perspective and with truly global capacities. So employers now expect graduates to be globally aware and to be able to operate across cultures. So this is one of the main advantage of the expansion of Tne provisions and the trends toward the borderless education. And again, there's a room for the students to improve their language skill, basically the English language skill as a key outcome. Although for some, this was largely written rather than the spoken English as their programs had been delivered in their local languages. Personal development benefits such as increased resilience, confidence, self-esteem, maturity, sometimes gaining opportunity to take part in some extra or co-curriculum activity with host country. This will provide invaluable experience to the students who are involved with these Tne activities. So the development of social contact is one such benefit. However, a number of economic and wider benefits arises as a result of UK institutional delivery of transnational education programs. And in addition to the free income, economic benefit include increased enrollment of international students resulting from the institution's in-country presence. So this can be in the form of articulation of arrangement or simply an enhanced profile, which result in more enrollment of the students. So conclusively, through regulatory system, normative rules, and cultural cognitive system, the learning experience of students and the competencies of academic staff could be richly enhanced. Additionally, a robust quality assurance system that is essential for promoting effective teaching and learning in Tne could be provided. However, while the prospects of Tne is very high, the challenges confronting the Tne providers at the national level require some attention. So even though here I am highlighting all the advantages of Tne, there could be certain limitation. Always when we are going with marketing or whatever the strategy, we know that we have certain benefit and certain limitations. And again, those who are really interested in doing another study related to the higher education marketing or Tne activities, you're always welcome to expand or extend this model by using a different context or by using different theory or by using different variable, if you like. So I think this is all about the Tne activities and marketization of higher education. And I think if you have any kind of question, you can ask, or else we can meet at the discussion section.
Thank you very much, Dr. Pereira. And this has indeed been insightful for all of us. There was so much to learn from your presentation. And we definitely look forward to having questions and answers from the participants at the end of the talk. Moving forward, we now have talk by Professor Nirma Jayawardena from Jindal Global Business School. To begin with her introduction, Dr. Nirma Sadamali Jayawardena completed BSc in Business Management with a first-class honors from NSBM Green University, Sri Lanka, and completed MBA in International Business from University of Colombo, Sri Lanka. She completed Graduate Diploma of Business Research and PhD in Marketing from Griffith University, Australia. Her research interests include social cognition, consumer visual memory, and digital video advertising strategies. In today's talk, she would be throwing insights on digital video advertising strategies, a social information processing theory perspective. I hand over the virtual dais to Professor Jayawardena.
Thank you, Professor Meenakshi, and thank you very much all the professors, all the participants for participating to this wonderful session. It's a great pleasure to share my PhD findings with you. So I will start my session now. I hope my screen is visible.
Yes, it is visible.
Okay, good afternoon. So thank you very much for making time to attend this seminar. I will share my PhD study findings with you, which I submitted on May 20th to Griffith University, Australia. So in my study, I investigated the consumer visual memory of 360-degree and standard video advertisements using the theoretical assumptions in the social psychological theory. So the social psychology theory which I have used was a theory of social information processing by Wire 2003. So in my study, I investigated the effects of 360-degree and standard video advertisements on consumer visual memory under single and multiple viewing conditions. So my two main research questions were, what is the differential effect of consumer visual memory on 360-degree versus standard video advertisements under single viewing conditions? And under study 2, I investigated the research question of what is the differential effect of consumer visual memory on 360-degree versus standard video advertisements after repeated viewing. I collected data using experimental surveys and interviews with 40 participants and analyzed using the qualitative thematic approach through the NVivo QSR software. So the theoretical constructs which I have used in the social psychology theory of information processing by Wire 2003 was the comprehender unit, encoder unit, inference maker unit, and the response selector unit. So in the single viewing time, I identified a total of 10 main themes under the 4 main categories of visual comprehension, encoding, inference making, and response selection. So these were color detection, facial expressions within the visuals, the location visuals, object visuals, people visuals, visuals on actions, and the multicultural symbols, behavioral engagement, visuals on product details, and visuals on brand details. So in the repeated viewing, I identified another 11 main themes under these 4 categories, which were again the color detection, facial expressions, plot or storytelling, visuals on locations, visuals on objects, visuals on people, actions, and then one new theme was identified as emotional engagement, behavioral engagement, and the product details and product benefit related information within the visual. So participants were attempted a little bit more curiosity, and they had some behavioral and emotional engagement in the second viewing. And also, not like the first viewing, they wanted to know more about the product details and the product benefits under the second viewing. So moving on to the introduction, now let's see what is a 360-degree and a standard video is. So a 360-degree video is a spherical video with video recording consisting the view in every direction. So these photo shoots will be conducted using an omnidirectional camera or a collection of cameras. Standard video advertisements are the online video advertisements created by experts from an agency. So actually, they in standard video, in the traditional video format, user does not have control over the viewing direction like this 3D videos. So they will see only the video content showed by the creator of the video. And I will show you the same image under 360-degree version and the standard version for you to identify the difference. So here, the first image is a 360 version and the bottom image is the 360 version and the first image is the standard version. So here the 360 version, you can see more details and more content, but in the standard version, the advertisement maker or the advertisement creator is trying to show us what they want us to see with some limited information. So in my study, I explored the consumer visual memory of 360-degree and standard video advertisements within these theoretical constructs of this via 2003 information processing theory. So now I will briefly explain the information process of this theory using this metaphorical representation. So this model has three major units, memory units, and 4 special purpose processing units, and also an executor. So in between this workspace and permanent storage unit, we can see that there is this executor. So this executor basically flows the information between these memory units and the processing units. So the 3 memory units include the workspace, the goal specification box, and the permanent storage unit. And the 4 processing units are comprehender, the first one, the comprehender, and then the encoder, inference maker, and the response selector. Now I will show you the sample application of this theory to a Lipton tea advertisement. Now here, the information in this advertisement, which will be applicable under input information, is the location, people, colors. So all this input information will flow into the sensory store. Now, sensory store means the 5 senses. Now, based on the 5 senses such as sight, smell, taste, touch, and hearing. For example, let's say sight represents the colors or images on locations, people, brand logo. Hearing will be the background or the theme music of the advertisement, or even it could be the dialogues. So other sensory store information such as touch, smell, and taste can be generated as feelings within the video advertisement. For example, people enjoying, if the setting of the advertisement is an evening tea party or about relaxing after a cup of tea at home. So the next processing unit of comprehender will extract all these themes in the advertisement, such as visuals, locations, people, logo, quotes, and this information will then be stored in the first section of the workspace unit. An executor will take this information to the permanent storage unit. So the workspace unit indicates our short-term memory, and the permanent storage unit indicates the long-term memory. So executor also retains the relevant information from the permanent storage unit, which means the long-term memory, and will do the further information processing like consumer age group information, quality attributes of the tea, the different tea flavors. Like normally in our long-term memory, we remember the tea taste, the tea flavor, and then we'll store the information which are able to stimulate or create goals in the human mind in the goal specification box. So these long-term information will then again stored in the goal specification box. For example, let's take to activate product quality related goals. The applicable information in the advertisement will be the Lipton brand name or the Lipton brand logo. So when we see the brand name and the brand logo, we will get some information about the product quality. And then to activate the quantity related goals, the information will be the tea bags in a box, the number of tea bags in a box. To activate the taste related goals, it is the tea flavors like strawberry, cinnamon, and health conscious goals like green tea, for an example. And then executor will then distribute this relevant information obtained from the long-term memory and the goal specification box, which means the permanent storage box and the goal specification box. This information will then executor will take to the 3 processing units of encoder, inference maker, and response selector. So under encoder, the encoder unit will extract the high order interpretations within this information. For example, it will extract the taste. Now, for example, if they can extract taste as the best encoded information over other several information depicting different tea flavors like green tea, strawberry flavor, cinnamon flavor, and also let's see health. If they take health, then the health is the best encoded information over green tea to lower cholesterol and diabetics. So this encoded information will directly come and stored in the second section of the workspace. And then moving to the inference maker, what inference maker does is it will extract the relevant information to form a subjective judgment. Now, for example, if the consumer is buying the product, let's say due to the brand name. So the brand name information is useful to judge the product. So the brand name, the colors they have used to recognize the brand name, the designs they have used to recognize the brand name, even the codes. So all these things we can use to recognize the brand name. So according to the WIRE 2003 model, this information under the inference maker will then be stored in the third section of the workspace unit. So the third section of the workspace unit means again within the short-term memory. And then when moving to the other processing unit, which is the response selector. Response selector transforms this subjective judgments to a clear response. Now, for example, consumer response can be due to the taste of the product. So, or maybe due to the health aspects of the products, or even it could be just for relaxation through a cup of tea. So all this information will then be stored in the fourth section of the workspace. So this is the overall application of this theory. Now, based on this application, I developed the experiments for each section. So the unit which I used was short-term memory under workspace unit. And under workspace unit, I developed the 4 experiments which will be covering the visual encoder, the first section, the visual comprehension, the first section, visual encoder, the second section, visual-based inference maker, which is the third section, and the visual-based response selector, which is the fourth section within the workspace unit. So, based on these theories, I collected data using the experimental surveys and interviews, semi-structured interviews, and I selected the same advertisement with 2 different paired versions, with 360 and standard version. So I selected one advertisement based on the pool of 360 and standard versions, and then in order to make it in order to have some make these variables constant, I selected the same advertisement with two paired versions with 360-degree and standard video versions. So in the single viewing condition, I found a total of 10 main themes, which was identified under the 4 categories of visual comprehension, visual-based encoding, visual-based inference making, and response selection. So these themes were color detection. So in the first, as the main theme, I identified that most females do talk about the colors. They talked about the colors of the advertisement, while male participants discussed more about the facial expressions. So this was some gender-based finding which I identified within this study. And then also the visuals on locations and visuals on objects and visuals on people, visuals on actions. And then again, I noticed that the multicultural symbols like the temples, other Asian buildings, so even the sakura trees, sakura flowers, so all these multicultural symbols were also noticed during within this advertisement time. And also in the 360-degree version, I saw some behavioral engagement than the standard version. They said, I felt the water, I felt this advertisement, I felt the waves. Likewise, they had some behavioral engagement in the 3D version than the standard version. And then the details they remembered were comparatively higher than the traditional format, because they said they felt the waves, they heard the sound. So one such advantage under 3D advertisement were again this behavioral engagement. And also the product details, the product packaging details, the expiry dates, the number of tea bags within the box, and also the visuals on brand details. And under the repeated viewing condition, a total of 11 main themes were identified under the 4 categories of visual comprehension, visual encoding, visual-based inference making, and visual-based response selection. So these themes were again the color detection. As I said, most of the females within the female participants, the color green, the color pink was highlighted through the software findings. And under the facial expressions, the relaxation, smiling, these sub-concepts were there under the facial expressions. And then plot and the storytelling. So the plot and the storytelling means this advertisement was about the Magnificent Matcha tea advertisement. It was a tea leaf journey from beginning to the end. The tea leaf was floating within the advertisement. So the plot or the storytelling visuals means within the second advertisement, participants was able to tell me the story of the tea leaf. So the beginning of the tea leaf, so how it floats and how it goes through these several stages and how it comes at the end of the day to our teacup as tea. So this journey was about in the advertisement, and they were able to dictate it to me really well within the second viewing, so under the repeated viewing. And then again, the visuals on locations, visuals on objects, visuals on people, the emotional engagement. So the emotional engagement means again, the feelings which they were able to get by viewing the advertisement. And the behavioral engagement, as I said, in the 3D video advertisement, they said they heard the waves, they felt the waves, and they felt like they were also flowing like the tea leaf. So these were taken under the sub-concepts to justify the behavioral engagement. And then the visuals on product details like the price, the quality details, and then again the product benefits. So some participants mentioned that no matter whatever the advertiser is trying to advertise, we will not buy if it is not healthy, if it is not with our taste, if it does not match our taste. So likewise, some product benefits were again highlighted within my study. So thank you very much for participating, and it is really nice to share my study findings with you. And feel free to ask any questions if you like during the panel discussion session.
Thank you very much, Professor Jayavardhana, for an insightful presentation.